Should the citizenship question be added to the census? There's a big brawl going on between Democrats and Republicans over whether or not the question, are you an American citizen, should be added to the U.S. Census. And before you think it is purely partisan, I want you to think again, because there are actually reasons either side might not want to add this question to the census. And there are maybe some reasons why both sides would want to add that question to the census. And we're going to get into that here because it's quite interesting. And I want to start by saying some of you have, I'm somebody who's not for getting rid of the Electoral College. And many of you have been mad at me about that in the past. And many of you have actually cited racism as the reason, saying that the reason why you want to get rid of the Electoral College is because of slavery, because it's rooted in slavery. Well, I've got some unfortunate news for you. So does this citizenship question, but not in the way that you might think. So we're going to get into all of that, and let's do that now. So first of all, this is going to be decided on by the Supreme Court, ultimately. So Democrats and Republicans are having this big battle right now, but the Supreme Court has already heard arguments on it, and they're going to be handing out their ruling on this later on this month. So we're going to find out what they say. But let's first start off with what is the census and how is it conducted? So the census happens every 10 years. It is part of the Constitution. The government needs to know how many people are here in the United States because we base our representative democracy off of this. How many reps are going to Washington is based on the population. How many electoral votes a state gets is based on the population. So it's part of the Constitution that every 10 years a census needs to happen. Not only does the census control the amount of representation in Washington and for the Electoral College, but it also determines tax dollars, where the tax dollars go, which areas need the tax dollars. So obviously, if you're an area that's highly populated, you're going to need more tax funding because you're going to need more schools, more roads, more hospitals, and you're going to need more natural disaster relief if something were to happen. So the census is extremely important. Now, they do the census based on physical residence. So they'll do phone calls to physical residents. They'll do door to door. They'll actually knock on your door up to 7 times to get your census data from you. Online, you could self-report online, which most people do these days. For the homeless, they have a big count one day. I think it's on April 1st. They do it in coordination with all the shelters and all the organizations, and they just count everybody in one night, and then they turn in those numbers. And if you don't participate in the census, it's a $5,000 fine, up to $5,000. So it's a big deal. So every 10 years, it's happening in 2020. So now let's get to the debate about the actual citizenship question. Now, the citizenship question hasn't been part of the census since 1950. And if you want to add it, you have to have a reason to add it. And this has now fallen on the Republicans because they're the ones who say that they want to have this question added. So it's up to them. The burden falls on them to prove why it should be in the census. And really, no matter how you slice it, whether you agree with the question being added or not, it's really politically motivated why they want to add it. So even if they have legitimate reasons for wanting to add it, it still ultimately boils down to for political gain. Non-citizens cannot vote, no matter what. So having them a part of the census, which, asking this question doesn't mean they're not part of the census, but the reasoning is that because of everything that's gone on since ICE and Donald Trump and the deportations and that ramped up rhetoric, that a lot of people who are not citizens, even if they're legally here, won't even want to take the census, that they'll just avoid the census altogether because they don't even want to be tracked down. They're afraid. And that is a legitimate concern considering everything that's been going on. So even if they do take the census, non-citizens can't vote. This doesn't change that. This isn't like all of a sudden we're giving citizens voting rights. They're not getting voting rights. That's just not happening. They have zero control over the representatives who get sent to Washington. They have zero control over who becomes president of the United States. They don't have any control over this. So they have absolutely no say. However, more non-citizens and immigrants tend to live in blue areas. So it's not like these non-citizens are going to vote in Democrats and that's why Republicans don't want them part of the census. They can't vote. But because of the numbers of population, and they do tend to live in areas that are blue, this would allow more blue representatives to go to Washington, and maybe blue states to have more electoral college votes. So Republicans say that it's just not right, that non-citizens aren't even supposed to be here, so they shouldn't have representation. But they're going to have a really hard time with that, because it was actually, and the Supreme Court is ultimately going to decide this, and they're going to have a hard time with this because actually it was conservatives who argued for non-citizens to be included in our representative democracy. The whole thing will come down to whether or not you think non-citizens should have representation. So a lot of people off the front will say, no, they're not citizens. They shouldn't be represented in this country. If they can't vote, that's it. But being represented and being able to vote are two totally different things. Like, for example, Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico sends people to Congress. They have reps that are sent. They have representation, but they're not allowed to vote. So they can't vote in anything, but they are able to be heard. They are able to advocate for their people. So we do have this notion that even if you can't vote, you should still have somebody advocating for you, some kind of representative, even if you don't get an actual physical vote. Now, we actually did put into the Constitution the ability for non-citizens to be represented. This was the 3/5 compromise. This is why it came down to, this was a conservative viewpoint. The slave owners, slaves were not citizens. They had no right to vote. That was the way it was. Slave owners advocated for the slaves to still have representation. So they came up with, for every 5 slaves, they would count as 3 people. That was the 3/5 compromise. So they didn't count as whole people. Only 3 out of 5 slaves would be counted towards the census, which would then be towards the representative democracy. Now, that's interesting for a couple of things. For one, if you're somebody who says, let's get rid of the Electoral College because it's rooted in slavery, then you would also have to say that you want to add the citizenship question to the census because you don't think, what you're essentially saying is you don't think non-citizens should be represented. That's what you're saying. So if you say, look, it's rooted in slavery because it gave slave owners more representation, yes, at that time, slaves were non-citizens and it benefited conservatives at that time. Conservatives got more reps in Congress and conservatives got more electoral college votes. But today, those non-citizens are more beneficial to liberals because those non-citizens tend to live in blue areas. Now, the second most populous state of non-citizens is Texas. Number 1 is California. Number 2 is Texas. So it's not actually like they're all living in blue states. It's actually almost 50-50. It's California, then Texas. Then you've got like New York and New Jersey and Nevada and Florida, and 2 of those are swing states. So it's not totally cut and dry. But you could argue that more immigrants live in blue areas and therefore more blue representatives would go to Congress and blue states would get more electoral college votes. So now you see it is flipped in favor of liberals when it used to be more in favor of conservatives. And this is kind of one of those scenarios where you should kind of be careful what you are against and for, because eventually one day, especially if it's politically motivated, because eventually it will flip and one day it'll be for you and one day it will be against you. So, politically motivated decisions are never a good idea for that reason. But the root of this still really comes down to whether or not you think people who are not citizens should have some sort of representation. Now, what slave owners argued and what people like myself who now live in populous area, I live in Los Angeles where there's a lot of non-citizen immigrants, slave owners and people like myself argue the same thing, which is, look, maybe they can't vote and maybe they don't have any rights, but they still impact my everyday life. And they're still essentially people that are in my sphere and people that need to be accounted for because they do have an impact on the region, on the everyday life, on resources. So for example, back in the day, if you were a slave owner and you were one person, and so the census would say 1 citizen, but you have 100 slaves, there's actually 101 of you. So if the government says, well, there's only 1 person there and then a natural disaster hits, then what would happen? They would send aid for one person when really there was 101 people. Or if they're trying to decide on where they're going to build a road and they say, well, they don't need a road. There's only one person there. And he's like, wait, no, there's actually 101 of us. So we do actually need a road that's created for our region. That is why having representation for these non-citizens is important, because they still have an impact on your daily life. They impact your schools. Their kids are American citizens. They're going to schools. They're still using the roads. They're still going and paying taxes when they buy things. They go grocery shopping. They spend money. They pay rent. They're doing all of these things and contributing to the economy. And so therefore they should get some sort of representation, even though they can't vote for that representation. That's where things get a little bit murky, right? Because slave owners, for sure, they were getting way more representation for their slaves, but the slaves couldn't even vote for those reps. So really the slave owners just voted in more people that were beneficial to them. That's one of the downsides of this. Same thing could go for these non-citizen immigrants. They don't get a say in who their rep is. Maybe they would get more representation, but would they? Because is it your representation if you're not the one voting for them, right? So on one hand, you could say we absolutely should add this question to the census because only American citizens should be represented. But that has huge implications when it comes to monetary distribution and natural disaster aid and just the overall impact that an area has. Not to mention, non-citizens eventually become citizens. And we see entire immigrant regions of the country that were maybe populated by Irish immigrants or Italian immigrants or Vietnamese immigrants or Chinese immigrants. And at one point, those massive groups of immigrants were not American citizens, but they still built massively beneficial communities that benefited our society, that paid taxes, that were a part of our community, even though none of these people could vote. And then eventually, after they put in their time, which is about a decade, they were able to vote and start having representation. But by then, it's a little bit late. Maybe their community should have had at least somebody, like Puerto Rico does, somebody go to Congress to represent them and to voice concerns on their behalf, even though they can't vote. So it's really an interesting question on whether or not people who live amongst us who cannot vote should have representation, and whether or not this citizenship question should be then added to the census. I'm definitely on the side of it absolutely should not be added because it does deter people from answering. A lot of people I know in my life are not American citizens, but they are legally here. And they're still afraid. They're afraid of what the new rhetoric's going to be, who's going to be the new target, are they going to be deported next, even though they're legally here. That is a concern a lot of people are having. And so they might feel really deterred from answering the census, from answering the citizenship question, and really just they would avoid the census altogether. They would kind of hide. And that would absolutely skew so much in developing regions, so much in regions that really need to continue to have representation. But I get it. I understand the other side too, because we've been there as liberals. Liberals have been on that other side of the argument when it was the 3/5 compromise. And that was that the non-slave states did not want non-citizens counted. The non-slave states did not want for that question, for representation for non-citizens. That was against the liberal agenda in the late 1700s. Now it's for the liberal agenda. So ultimately, fundamentally, you have to think of what is the census for. And it is fundamentally for figuring out the number of people in regions to create our representative democracy and to figure out how much tax dollars need to go where and which programs need more funding than others. So ultimately, you just need to count the people. And when it comes to voting, that's when you can deal with who's eligible to vote for which representatives. And that's what it should ultimately come down to. But if I were one citizen living in a region of, let's say, 1,000 non-citizens, I still think my region needs one rep that's going to go to Congress and advocate for this region that is being highly impacted by these 1,000 people. That to me seems really fair, rather than me being lumped in with another rep that and these people just being invisible, like completely invisible, as if there's no impact from them whatsoever when there absolutely is. So it's interesting. It's an interesting debate. I can see both sides of this, honestly, as hopefully you can too as well from this. And would love to hear your thoughts down below. And also you can Instagram me your thoughts. You can find me on Instagram at Kim Iverson. Thank you so much for watching. Thanks for supporting this show. I do have a Patreon, also a PayPal. I do often get demonetized when I talk about things like war and terror. And it has, so your support is absolutely been a lifesaver for me. So thank you so much. I appreciate it. And I'll see you guys next time.